The cycle is returning like a quiet motion beneath the surface. Something most people only sense through the faint tremors of the market, through the slow tightening of liquidity spreading across the banking system, through the subtle shift in how governments begin talking more about fiscal discipline while spending even more, and through that familiar feeling that something once happened is happening again. Yet no one can clearly point out where the line lies between normal and abnormal, between stability and collapse. These movements are never loud, never show up in bold headlines, and cannot be captured by a single chart. They are more like the air in a sealed room slowly changing, so slowly you don't even notice it, but enough for the entire system to stretch and contract the same way it has in every major transition of financial history. What is happening is not news, not a sequence of disconnected events you can piece together like fragments of an economic bulletin, but a pre-programmed pattern, running on the long rhythm of monetary history, with the visible surface being only the final stage of mechanisms that were activated years earlier. And then you realize one thing that makes this moment different. This cycle is triggering earlier than history, earlier than any macro data can justify, earlier than even the people who understand the system expected. This is not a prediction. This is a mechanism. The interesting thing about every currency collapse is that it is almost never understood correctly at the moment it unfolds. People say it's a recession. It's not. People blame inflation. It's not. People point to the stock market. It's not that either. All of these are just surface tensions, while the real mechanism sits deep underneath, where short-term debt, fast-maturing obligations, and immediate liquidity needs are woven into long-term financial promises made by governments and institutions, forming a structure where a single imbalance triggers tremors across the entire system. The real mechanism has nothing to do with rising or falling prices nor GDP, but with the widening gap between the speed at which governments must raise capital and the speed at which the real economy can generate the cash flows needed to fill an ever-expanding hole. When short-term debt balloons and long-term cash flows slow, the system becomes like a bridge pushed beyond its original design limit. It doesn't snap at once, but every steel beam bends slightly, every anchor point heats up, and anyone watching from a distance can see the entire structure drifting out of equilibrium. This is the true starting point of a reset, not the moment everything breaks, but the moment the mechanism collides with its own limits. What makes this pattern so powerful almost beyond time is that it has appeared 3 times in modern history with striking clarity. Like 3 markers outlining the recurrence of long cycles most people were never taught to recognize. 1929, 1971, 2008, 3 moments that look unrelated, explained by different narratives, tied to different contexts, yet when placed on a cycle map, they form a continuous curve stretching across the century. It is no coincidence that 1929 opened the Great Depression and erased the old financial structure. It is no coincidence that 1971 ended the gold standard when the US was forced to break the biggest promise of the post-war era. And it is no coincidence that 2008 exposed the hole at the center of the global credit system, forcing central banks into unprecedented easing. When you look deeper, all 3 crises fall within the 40 to 45-year structural cycle of monetary resets, and simultaneously within the 80 to 90-year-long cycle of global financial power realignment. These cycles don't run in parallel. They intersect, creating convergence points where each meeting triggers a major transformation of the world's monetary system. And now, after nearly a century, those cycles are converging once again. And now, 2024 to 2027 aligns almost perfectly. This is the moment you begin to see the pattern not as speculation, but as a stable operating structure, one so consistent that if someone hid 2 centuries of economic data and gave you only the timeline, you could still predict the next movement. The essence of a currency collapse is not the final shock. It is the long-term forces that have been pulling the system for years. The first force is the erosion of hidden liquidity. Something never mentioned in the news because it doesn't appear in official reports, yet it determines the system's ability to sustain its normal state. When hidden liquidity contracts, the economy becomes a body suddenly short of oxygen, still standing, still moving, but every step slower and heavier. The second force is the silent tremor in the repo market, where banks borrow overnight to patch short-term holes. When repo rates inch up while broader rates stay flat, it is always a sign that someone no longer holds enough collateral. The third force lies in long-term bonds, especially when the yield curve stays inverted far longer than normal. distorting long-term capital costs and forcing institutions to reallocate risk. The fourth force is government debt, when borrowing accelerates faster than revenue, eroding the credibility of sovereign bonds layer by layer. And the final, deepest force is the fragmentation of the petrodollar, not when a country dramatically announces its exit, but when global oil trade quietly stops requiring USD as its default settlement, loosening the natural circulation loop of the dominant currency. These forces have appeared before every major monetary shift. The financial world sees them clearly, the average person does not. That is why this pattern always feels sudden to outsiders, while to those who study the structure, the break is simply the last moment of a curve that began long ago. When the system enters the intersection of these forces, it has no choice but to move toward a new point of balance, what people mistakenly call a reset. But a reset is not an event. It is the inevitable result of long-term forces converging at one point, forcing the system to rearrange its entire architecture so it can survive the next cycle. And that next cycle always begins with the reconfiguration of the central currency. Look at 1929 and you see the USD shift its role. Look at 1971 and you see the USD shed its gold anchor to enter a new era of dominance. Look at 2008 and you see the USD step into a liquidity-based supremacy. Now, as 2024 to 2027 opens, the question is no longer which currency collapses, but which mechanism is forcing the world into a new monetary cycle. Once you can see the pattern clearly, the next thing you need to observe is not the surface-level news or the moment-to-moment volatility, but the 5 hidden signals that always appear before the system steps into a transition zone. They make no noise, they don't sit at the center of macro data, yet they function like underground currents shaping the direction of the entire monetary structure. The first signal always comes from hidden liquidity, something the market has never interpreted correctly. It's not about how much money is pumped in or withdrawn, but about the speed at which real money circulates among major financial institutions. When that circulation slows, the surface economy may look bright, but the foundation underneath grows colder and more rigid. Much like a city lit brilliantly at night while the power lines behind the glow are wearing thin. No one notices because no official chart reveals it. But large institutions feel the drag instantly as they must rotate capital faster, just to maintain positions that used to require only a light touch. The second signal is found in the repo market, where overnight borrowing functions as the circulatory system of the system. Repo is where the truth shows up first because it has no time to hide. When repo rates climb unexpectedly, it isn't about interest rates rising in general. It's the sign that someone no longer has enough collateral to cover their short-term holes. Small shifts in repo resemble the quickened breath of a body trying to maintain its normal rhythm. If you see repo heating up for several days in a row, you can be certain that a major institution is struggling to maintain balance and is forced to rotate assets at a pace tighter than safety allows. This happened in 2007 when U.S. banks suddenly lacked sufficient high-quality collateral. It appeared again in 2019 when overnight repo spiked to 10% in a single night. And now, the signal is returning in a weaker but unmistakable form. The third signal comes from long-term bonds, especially when the yield curve stays inverted far longer than any normal period in recorded history. A short inversion is simple, the market expects a recession. But a long, persistent, months-long, sometimes year-long inversion is no longer expectation. It's a distortion in the structure of long-term cash flows. When long-term capital costs no longer reflect real risk, institutions are forced to restructure their portfolios, triggering ripple effects across the credit system. A prolonged yield curve inversion isn't a signal of crisis. It is an admission that the system is standing in a position misaligned with its own future cash flows. If you look across time, you'll see this pattern showing up. Before the breaks of 2000, 2006, and 2020, the fourth signal is government debt. Debt itself is not the problem. The speed of debt is the problem. When debt grows faster than revenue, you're witnessing an imbalance no government can sustain indefinitely. This isn't a moral argument about fiscal discipline. It's a simple physics equation, obligations maturing faster than the system can generate cash. In recent years, many governments have increased their debt not because they wanted to stimulate their economies, but because they had no other way to keep the system standing. When debt surpasses the real economy's absorption capacity, investors begin to demand higher risk premiums. Capital flows shift, and sovereign bonds gradually lose their status as risk-free assets. That is when the system enters a long slide that no central bank can reverse with a single policy decision. The final signal, strongest, deepest, is the fragmentation of the petrodollar. Fragmentation is not an event. It is the slow process of global energy transactions, no longer being forced to route through the USD as their singular settlement conduit. When more oil and gas deals are settled in other currencies, the USD's circulation loop begins to lose rhythm. Every monetary empire relies on a central circulation loop. The British pound in the 19th century relied on colonial trade. The US dollar in the 20th century relied on energy. When that loop fractures, the reserve currency loses part of its natural gravitational pull. Not immediately. Not with an announcement. But through thousands of small transactions redirecting themselves into new channels, weakening the USD's pull piece by piece. This is a signal the average person never sees, but the financial world sees with absolute clarity because it touches the core of monetary power, the power of circulation. Once these 5 signals appear together, the question is no longer when the break will happen, but what window forces a reset to become the only available path. The reason 2026 to 2027 becomes the convergence point isn't due to a single factor, but to 5 forces operating simultaneously. It is the moment hidden liquidity hits a structural low, repo becomes unstable, long-term bonds lose their balance, government debt reaches a threshold where buyers demand a risk premium the issuer can't bear, and the petrodollar loses enough gravitational pull that energy trade no longer defaults to USD. These forces don't need to align by date. They only need to converge within a 2 to 3 year span for the system to be pushed into a new equilibrium. A reset is not a voluntary choice. It is the natural result of these forces compressing into one point. The system does not choose to reset. It is forced to reset. And when that happens, the world always splits into 2 groups. The losing group includes those whose assets sit heavily in layers dependent on cheap liquidity, those who make decisions based solely on surface-level market signals, and those who believe the system will continue operating like it has for the past 2 decades. The winning group shares 3 traits. They position themselves to benefit from liquidity shifts. They view cycles as structures rather than predictions, and they understand that each reset does not destroy value, it relocates it. A reset does not erase value, it changes where value sits. This series is not meant to trigger fear or create alarm, but to open a mental map very few people have ever had access to. And what you've seen in this section is only one corner of that map. The remaining pieces, the other mechanisms that connect into the larger picture, will appear in the next video. Even if the topic is no longer within this same cycle,